guys. Welcome back to the Unfiltered Political Lens podcast. Today, we're going to be doing part one of a 10-part series of the inflation war and how global conflict is destroying America's purchasing power. Without further ado, we're going to get right into it. The truth is, most Americans feel like something is fundamentally changing in the country, even if they can't fully explain it yet. People go to the grocery stores, and suddenly a few bags of food cost over $100. Families look at their utility bills and their rent, their insurance, their gas tank, and they ask themselves a serious question. How are the ordinary people supposed to survive like this for the long term? And while politicians on television argue over statistics, averages, and the economic talking points, millions of the working class Americans feel like the pressure of every single day. The reality is that this global conflict in government spending, inflation, and the economic instability are all deeply connected. And whether people realize it or not, the wars happening thousands of miles away can absolutely affect the financial survival of families right here in America. Tonight, we're going to break down how global conflict fuels inflation, why the purchasing power of the United States continues weakening over time, and why the average citizen always ends up carrying the burden of geopolitical instability. Because once you understand how this system works, you begin to realize that inflation is not just some random event. It's not magic, it's not accidental. Inflation is often the direct result of policy decisions of the global crisis and financial systems reacting to the instability. And right now, the world is entering one of the most economically unstable periods we've seen in decades. When conflict erupts in major parts of the world, especially regions tied to energy production or global trade, markets immediately react. The oil prices become volatile, shipping costs increase, and the insurance cost for transportation rises. Investors panic and governments prepare for emergency responses, and because of the oil prices in modern civilization, the energy prices eventually affect almost every aspect of life. Most people don't realize how dependent the global economy is on stable energy markets. If oil becomes more expensive, tracking, uh, let's see, for instance, trucking becomes more expensive. Farming becomes more expensive. Manufacturing becomes more expensive. Airlines become more expensive, and shipping containers become more expensive. And once the transportation costs rise and food prices rise because of the groceries, they must be moved across cities and states in the country. And that means a military conflict in the Middle East can literally affect the price of milk, eggs, bread, and gasoline in small town America within the weeks or months. This is why the global stability matters economically, and the world is interconnected now more than ever before. And and the economic consequences of the war also spreads rapidly across financial systems. And what makes the situation even more dangerous is how governments respond during these crises. Historically, during periods of war, recession, or instability, governments increase the spending dramatically. Central banks often inject money into the economies to prevent the collapse. Instead, the rates are manipulated and emergency spending bills are passed. Massive debt accumulates as well. The idea behind these policies is usually to stabilize the markets and prevent economic panic. But there's a major problem that economists have warned about for generations. You cannot endlessly expand the money supply without consequences. When the governments create trillions of new dollars while production struggles to keep up, the inflation becomes inevitable. Too much money begins chasing too few goods, and once the inflation begins spreading through the economy, it becomes extremely difficult to reverse without causing pain to somewhere in the system. Now, here's the part many Americans feel emotionally but may not fully understand economically. While inflation acts like a hidden tax on the working class and the middle class, wealthy individuals often own the assets that rise with the inflation: stocks, real estate, commodities, business ownership. But ordinary workers who depend on the wages and the savings accounts often get crushed. Their paychecks lose purchasing power while costs rise faster than the income. This is why so many people feel that they're running harder but getting nowhere financially. Even when the wages are increasing slightly, the inflation often eats away at the gains. A person may technically earn money, more money than they did 5 years ago, but if the groceries and the housing and the health care, as well as your insurance, they all rise dramatically, their quality of life can still decline. This creates frustration and a hopelessness and eventually distrust in our institutions. And speaking of the distrust, one of the biggest economic stories unfolding right now is the collapse of confidence people have in long term financial stability. Americans are beginning to question whether the economic system will work for ordinary people. The younger generations especially feel the pressure, and many millennials and Gen Z Americans look at home prices and student loan debts, inflation and stagnant wages in their income. Today, many families require dual incomes and still struggle to keep up with the basic expenses of life. And that growing gap between the expectations and the reality is creating enormous social tension across the country. Now, let's talk about specifically about war spending and how it affects the inflationary pressures. Historically, war has always been expensive, whether it's military operations, foreign aid, weapons manufacturing, or logistical support and reconstruction efforts. Conflicts require the enormous amounts of money, and the governments often finance the additional spending packages and their increases long term and financial obligations. But as the debt rises, interest payments rise, and eventually the taxpayers shoulder that burden through inflation or taxation or reduced purchasing power. The average citizen rarely sees the immediate cost up front, but over time the economic consequences accumulate steadily and annoyingly slowly. Another critical issue is the supply chain disruption. Our modern economies depend on the global supply chains functioning smoothly. The products are assembled using the materials and the components from multiple countries, and if war disrupts those shipping lanes, or the ports, the factories, or transportation routes, shortages begin to appearing. And during recent years, the Americans witnessed how fragile supply chains really are. Shortages hit everything from electronics to automobiles to pharmaceuticals. And once the shortages emerged, the prices rise became where the demand exceeded the supply. And when consumers began to panic buying or hoarding their products, inflation worsens even faster. Markets become emotional. Fear spreads and business raise prices to protect the profits, and consumers blame the corporations. The corporations, however, blame global instability, and the politicians blame each other. Meanwhile, the average family just tries to survive another month. There's one thing many experts are increasingly concerned about is the possibility of a prolonged global instability, like another war, for instance. We are no longer living in a simple unipolar world where the nation dominates everything economically and militarily without challenges. The rising tensions between the major powers, the energy competition, the sanctions and cyber warfare, and the economic fragmentation are all creating uncertainty. And the uncertainty is one of the biggest enemies of our economic confidence. Businesses delay the investments during unstable times, and our consumers reduce spending. Investors They seek their safe assets. Markets fluctuate widely, and all of these behaviors can slowly, you know, economic growth, it can slow it, as well as simultaneously contributing to the inflation itself and the pressure on this everyday citizen. And when there's a psychological impact of the inflation, which changes the human behavior, and people become more stressed and more anxious and more politically divided. The families argue more about their finances, their savings become harder to maintain. Retirement feels less secure. Economic fear starts influencing the elections, the media narratives, and social stability itself. Either throughout history, periods of severe inflation or economic decline, they all have often led to political extremism or social unrest and declining trust in leadership. That's why the inflation is not just an economic issue, it's a social issue. It affects the mental health of not only family dynamics, crime rates, but also birth rates and long term national confidence. Now, despite everything we're discussing tonight, this is not a message of hopelessness. It's a message of the awareness, because the truth is that informed people are better prepared and are better prepared people. And understanding how the inflation works helps the families make smarter financial decisions. Understanding how global conflict affects markets helps people avoid the emotional reactions, and the panic rarely leads to good decisions. Preparation does, and in uncertain times, the resilience becomes incredibly valuable. Americans may not control the global wars or central banks or the trillion-dollar government policies, but they can control how they respond personally. They can reduce their unnecessary debt, they can build emergency savings, and they can become more financially disciplined. They can invest in valuable skills, and they can prepare intelligently instead of emotionally. One of the most important things the viewers need to understand is that the inflation compounds over time. Even moderate inflation slowly destroys purchasing power year after year. This is why older Americans often say things like, "I remember when a dollar actually meant something," because over the decades, the value of currency changes dramatically. A family that once thrived comfortably on one income now often struggles with two incomes. That is just nostalgia. It's a reflect, genuine long-term currency and erosion, and the cost of living increases. And if geopolitical instability continues rising globally, the inflationary pressures could remain a major issue for years ahead. The challenge facing America now is balancing the economic stability with the geopolitical responsibility. The United States remains one of the most powerful economies on earth, but the power does not eliminate the consequences. Endless debt, growth, persistent inflation, and global instability, they all create long-term risks that cannot be ignored forever. And the question becomes whether leaders can restore the confidence and stabilize the costs and rebuild the economic security of ordinary citizens before the public frustration reaches dangerous levels. Because at the end of the day, people do not care about the abstract economic theories nearly as much as they care about survival. They care about feeding their children, paying their rent, as well as affording health care, savings for retirement, and building a future when millions of people feel like the future is slipping away. Societies begin changing politically, culturally, as well as emotionally. So, as we move forward in this series, please remember the central truth. The global conflict does not stay overseas anymore. In the modern world, economic shockwaves and travel instantly. The wars affect energy, and energy affects our inflation, and inflation affects families. The families affects the politics, and politics affects stability. Everything is connected, and the better Americans understand those connections, the better prepared they will be whatever comes next. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in part 2. Peace.